Okay, so this is my new tutorial format, which I'm breaking into 3 stages. So stage 1 is just talking about the goal, what do we actually want to achieve. Stage 2 is the simple steps of the tutorial, and stage 3 is the details in depth, how the code works, how the CSS or JavaScript works. So I hope you like this format, and please give me some feedback as to anything you think that I need to improve. Thank you. Okay, so the goal of this tutorial is to create these look at me buttons. I've got 3 here on the screen. So the first one we're going to create is if I roll my mouse over, I get this pulsating border and it stands off the page a bit. So it moves to the top left a bit and the drop shadow below it increases in size and decreases in opacity to make it look like it's actually moving away from the page. So that's the first button. The second button we're going to create is using exactly the same global CSS, and we change some of the attributes to get this effect here, which is larger red border pulsating, pretty much the same as the first button, but it's a larger border and it's pulsating. Then we get the third button where we've got a larger again border, and the timing function for the pulsing is totally different. So it zooms out quickly, disappears, and then comes back in quickly. So very, very different timing effect to these two. So that's the goal of this tutorial. So here we go. All right, so in this video, we're going to make some cool little attention-getting buttons. We're going to make it with pure CSS. It's going to have some global styles, so if you just apply the styles, you'll get your effect that you like. It'll also be customizable for each button. So it's a really, really cool little effect, and I want to run through this now. First thing we need to do is we need to make sure we've got a blank page. I've just got this on one of my dev sites that I use for mucking around. So at the moment, I have 0 content on this page. So if we go back to the tutorial, so in here, what we're saying is going to demonstrate standard Elementor Button Widget styled with some CSS to make it round with a pulsating border when you hover your mouse over it. All right, so let's get into that. And this is pure CSS, no JavaScript is required. So really, really cool. So let's have a look at the first step. So the CSS rules, as it says here, we've got to copy and paste the CSS below to your preferred location. Now, that will depend down here. It's a copy code down here. It'll depend on whether you have Elementor Pro or not. If you have Pro, simple, just follow these steps. If you have free, this particular set of rules uses the keyword selector, which does not work with free. You'll need to replace that with your own unique class name if you're going to paste that into the customize for WordPress. Absolutely encourage you to get Elementor Pro. Not only does it give you the selector in your CSS, it gives you so much more features that I can't do without the Pro version, quite frankly. So what we're going to do is just, as it says here, we're just going to click on this code block, which will copy it to the clipboard. Go back to our page. What we're going to do is go into our site settings, custom CSS, simply paste that code into there. We'll run through this a little bit later. We're going to go back to the editor. Now, the second step is to create our buttons. So we're going to create 3 buttons with different effects on each one. First one will just have our standard global styles, and the button 2 and button 3 we will edit to have a different effect. So the first one, we're just going to drag a button to the editor. We're going to add this class to the button. I'm going to copy that there. Just going to get a button. Where's my buttons? There we go. Drag it into here. And all we have to do is go to the advanced and add the class to it. Straight away, we've got our button with the effect. Really cool little effect. We've got a pulsating border. And as we roll our mouse over it, it animates slightly up and to the left. And there's a box shadow which extends to look like it's standing off the page. So watch the box shadow in the background as I roll my mouse over. So it starts off with a very, very slight box shadow. just to look like it's standing off slightly. Roll my mouse over, the box shadow expands as the button moves up to the top left. So nice little effect. And that's pretty much all we have to do to get button number 1 working. Okay, let's go back to our instructions. So button number 2, we want to right click on button 1 and duplicate it. In the first step, I mentioned here I've got to add a 3 pixel padding on all sides. You can make this whatever you like. Do not use margin because of the way we're constructing the CSS for this. We'll go into the detail section. Margin will distort the border. So use padding for your spacing. Just delete this one I just created. Add some padding of 3 pixels. And then I'll right click and duplicate. So now I've got some spacing between the buttons by using padding. All right. So button 2, back to here. What we're going to do is go into our advanced attributes. And we're going to add this block here to the styles. Now, the way the attributes work is you put the attribute name, the type character, and then the CSS after. These are standard CSS rules. Again, I'll explain those a little bit later. So if we just copy that, go to our second button, advanced, go to the attributes, and paste those in there. In the editor, we will notice no difference. That's because the editor does not process these attributes into the actual element attributes. Only on the front end that happens. So, all right, so let's have a look at the button 3. We can save and look at it if we want to, but let's go to button 3. Go to right click on button 2, duplicate that. And this time we're going to copy this rule here. And we're going to paste that into the advanced, the attributes. Update that. Okay, now just quickly looking at this, what I'm doing in the first one, I'm setting the border color to red, the max border width to 12, so that's when it pulsates as it scales outwards. The maximum width of the border is 12 pixels, and the maximum scale, so that's how big the border scales, is 1.5. In the second one, we're making the border color blue. We're giving it a broader border on the maximum. So it goes from 1 pixel to the maximum on the animation. And then we're setting the max scale as 2. So it scales a little bit bigger. And we're slowing down the amount of time by telling it to animate over 2 seconds. So that's the difference between these two. Let's have a look what effect that actually has. And we'll look at them live. So if I view the page, it is there. Roll my mouse over the first one, I just get the standard CSS border. Roll my mouse over the second one, I've got my red border, which is expanding larger, and the thickness of the border when it's at the maximum point is larger. See that there? So that's orange, a narrow border at the maximum end. This one's red with a larger border at maximum. Then we go to the last one, and it's blue with a larger border again, and it's a slower animation. So that's pretty much what we want there. So it's pretty simple. Now you've got 3 really cool little look at me buttons, and they have a different animation on the border. Now, they all have the same standoff effect. You can change through those variables. You can change how far this moves to the top left, and that'll also affect the shadow as well, just by changing the variables. All right, now, so we're pretty much done with adding our 3 buttons. And now I want to talk about customizing the animation timing. This is really, really cool. So what I've done is, quickly, I've got a variable called timing function, which we can set. I'm going to talk through how we actually find out what we want. The first thing we need is our Chrome DevTools. Come back to the screen, I'm going to press F12 to bring up my Chrome DevTools. We then want to use the Element Selector button, and we want to click on the button 3. So Element Selector button here. We're going to click on button 3. Make that a little bit bigger. Might just use the Control+ to zoom in on this a little bit so you can see these a little bit better. Do that again. Okay, so you can see this A is selected when I clicked on that. Now we want to go up the DOM a little bit till we get to the element that's got the class we added to the top level, which is the WPG button round pulse. If we move our mouse up the DOM here, we get to this element here, which has got the WPG button round pulse. Okay, now we want to actually force a state of hover so we can see what it looks like. So we're going to right click on that element and force the state of click hover. I'm going to right click on this element down here, force state hover. Now you can see our animation going regardless of whether our mouse is over it or not. So we've done that, and then we want to click on the before pseudo element in the after that element. If you look down the DOM a little bit, so there's the one we just told to hover. Just after that, we've got a before pseudo selector. So if we just click on that, we're actually looking at the pseudo element, which is the before. On the right hand side, we're looking at the animation timing function. So I think I've noted that here. Look at the styles window for the animation timing function. Currently be set to var timing function. So that's it there. Just click on the actual word animation timing function, press the tab key and just type ease. Okay. And what we get now is we notice that this would have changed, and we also get like a little pink icon there where we can actually play with this. So if I click on that, there's our icons there. If we click on some of these and just watch this animation at the same time, we'll get something like what we want. Keep zooming through them, click through them. That one's relatively close to what we want. Maybe we want that. Okay. If we want that, we can just click one of these. That'll give us the cubic bezier. If we want to change it, we can actually drag some of these. Let's say that's what we want. So it zooms out quickly, disappears for a bit, and then comes back. Let's say we're happy with that animation. And now we're going to copy this cubic bezier here. So just use your mouse and then either right click copy or Control C. And we'll go back to our instructions page here. And what we're saying here is we're going to go back to the advanced and attributes. We're going to add this timing function with the bezier cube there. So let's have a look there. Okay, now what we want to go to is our button 3. And we want to go to our advanced attributes. We want to add, make sure we've got a semicolon at the end to separate these. Dash dash timing dash function colon, and let's paste our cubic bezier in that we just copied from that screen. State that. A new tab. Now it's got the timing function that we added to it. So that's how we can animate or change the timing function to get a different effect. So we can change the height, the width, we can change the border color, we can change the thickness of the border at its maximum size, we can change the speed or the duration that it uses for the animation, and we can change the scale. If you want to see all of the things that you can change, just go back to your custom CSS and you can change any of these properties here by just going to the going to the attributes tab and just adding them in there and giving them a value. As long as you've got the style, the pipe before it, and each of these is separated by a colon, and in between all of these properties are the standard CSS syntax. So it's dash dash max dash scale, colon, and then the value. Dash dash duration, colon, and then the value. So that's pretty much it. So I hope that is something that you can work with and play with the CSS and play with these values and come up with some really cool ideas. And I look forward to seeing what you do with it. Okay, so part 3, the nuts and bolts. So again, we're looking at the side settings custom CSS. So we can see this a little bit better, I'm going to copy all. So Control A, Control C to copy. I'm going to bring up my Notepad++. I'm going to paste it into there, set my language to CSS, so we get some highlighting. It's much bigger, so we can actually zoom in on this so you can see what's going on now. So looking at the CSS, so what we're using firstly is this selector keyword. Now this is unique to Elementor Pro, and what it does is it puts a unique class ID in front of these rules, which makes it more specific. The reason I did this was some of my rules were being overridden by Elementor defaults, and instead of making my rules more and more specific, putting the selector keyword just makes it work. I prefer doing that rather than making things important, like important keyword. Important keyword, in my view, should very rarely be used because it interferes with CSS precedence of hierarchical precedence, which is not good practice in my view. So I would rather make the rules more specific so that it applies because it's more specific rather than trick the browser into thinking it's more specific with the important keyword, if that makes sense. So what we're doing here in the top level, the WPG button round pulse, at the very top level, we're setting some variables here. So these variables here, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 variables there. And so that we don't have to go to each button and set the width to auto and the margin to 0, I'm just doing that within this rule. So you don't need to worry about the Elementor settings. This will override them anyway if you did change them. Because we want the buttons to be inline auto. We don't want them to be full width because our borders aren't going to work properly. So we always want them to be that. So let's just set that here. Reason I put margin 0 on there is because this is applied to a widget, and with Elementor, it applies a 20 pixel spacing between the widgets using margin, and we do not want that for these buttons. Otherwise, what happens is that the last button just looks different to the other buttons. So that's the reason we've done this. So stepping through, we've got a border color, duration, how long is the duration for the animation, what's the maximum size it's going to use the CSS scale to scale the border to, what is the height and width of the buttons. If you want it bigger, you can make it bigger here as a global setting, or you can override it with attributes, which we showed in the tutorial. Min border width, so at the beginning of the button animation, the border animation, what is the size? At the end of it, what's the size? So you can change those here. These work pretty well for me. The standoff, so that's how many pixels to move the button by to give it that standoff effect. And our timing function here, which we played with previously, I could set that here to say the default is linear. I could make that ease. So it eases in and out as a default, whatever works for you. Then you can override these on a per button basis if you want to. So that's pretty much the top level rules here. We then have some basic width and height settings for the actual button. Now let's go to the actual button and have a look at it on the page. We've already got there. I'm going to bring up my Chrome DevTools and have a look at this code here. So if we go to the top level of that button, we've got an element, which is where our class for the rules we're looking at was applied. Then under that element, we've got a before pseudo selector, which we're using for the border. Now, I was trying this by using the overlay, but with the buttons, it's a strange thing. In the editor, it adds an overlay element, but in the front end, it doesn't. So I decided to use the before pseudo selector instead. So that's where it's applying the effect to for the expanding border. We've then got a widget container, button wrapper, and then we've got our button. So that's the hierarchy that we're looking at. So if we go to our rules here, so we've got our unique selector to make it specific, a class we've added to the widget, and then we want to target the button itself. We set the width and height to the variables here or the attribute you've set. set the display to flex and the direction to column so that we can align the content in the center. So what happens with these buttons if you don't do that? The text for this button sits at the top. So they actually put it in a span, and that span just sits at the top of the button unless you make it flex and then set the alignment to the center. So that's what that's all about. We set the border radius to the width. So we want to make it a circle. We can make it half the width, but what I find with these browsers that if you make it bigger than what it's meant to be, it gives you a pure circle anyway. So it works anyway, but if you find in a particular browser that that doesn't work for you, you might want to do a calc width divided by 2. You can do that there if you like. So basic settings for our button to make it round and align the text element, which is the span, to the center. This button's standoff. So again, we're targeting the button and we're giving it a box shadow of 1 pixel by 1 pixel standoff, 5 pixel blur. We're giving it a RGBA value of black with 66 hex opacity. So that gives us this very slight box shadow when we're not hovering. We then want to set the on hover, so the same button. When we set the hover, sorry, not on the button, on the actual wrapper element, so this widget element up here, when that's hovered, we want to set the Z index to really, really high so that it comes on top of the other button. So if we look at this, we click on the center one, it overlaps the first one, even the shadow will. We click on the, hover over the third one, and that overlaps everything as well by setting the Z index. We then want to translate the Y and the X. Now, what we set up here was our standoff of 8 pixels. Down here, what we're telling it to do is translate it by a calculation of -1 times the standoff. The reason we do that is because Firefox does not understand negation of variables, but if you multiply by -1, it does the same thing. So if you don't do the negation, if you went minus var1 or 1 minus or 0 minus var standoff, it'll work in Chrome, won't work in Firefox. This works in both. That's the reason we do the -1 times. Then we want to set the transition for that, the transform property for the duration that we set up here, or the attribute we use to override it. Straightforward so far. Right, now what we want to now do is when the button is hovered, so that's just the widget, but when the button is hovered, we want to do a box shadow of 16 pixels by a calculation of the standoff times 2. So we've got an 8 pixel standoff, so that'll be a 16 pixel. This would end up being a 16 pixel blur with a standoff of 16 pixels. We could probably put in the same here. We can do the var standoff if we wanted to. So we can do the var standoff there by var standoff. And it makes it more linked to whatever you set that value to. So it could be the standoff of 8 pixels. Actually, that's wrong. We want to actually do this. Probably a better rule here. Actually, let's just, while we're doing this, let's say my standoff equals, oops, not equals, colon, then it's calc var standoff times 2. And then now what we can do is use my standoff here. So this isn't in the copyable CSS that's in my tutorial, but it's definitely something you could use. So what we're doing now, oops. So what we're doing here is saying that our standoff, var my standoff, is the standoff times 2. And then we're making the X and Y offset for the box shadow to be basically twice the standoff, and then the blur to be twice the standoff. If you want to be more blurred, you can make that 3 times the standard, whatever you want to do. And then the opacity of the entire blur to be 33 hex. So that's going to give us the larger background, so the larger background blur on the button as it moves. Okay. All right, so that's the button shadow. The pulsing border. So again, we're using the before pseudo selector to add a position absolute, top 0, right 0, bottom left 0, which means it's going to be the same size as its parent container and with a radius of whatever the width is. Okay, so that could be twice the width, whatever you want, half the width. And we want to set the pointer events to none. If we don't do that, what happens is that the border sits on top of the button and it makes the button not clickable. We make sure we got no pointer events on the border. That's just an animation. So that's just set as the border getting ready to go. And then when we hover over the widget, we want to then set the before animate using these keyframes, that duration, fill motor forwards, infinite count, and our timing function. So in our tutorial, we worked through using the default one that was set up here, in this case be ease, or using a cubic Bezier, which we calculated. So that will use that. The timing function, now keyframes, all we're doing it is saying the border is from the min width solid, the border color, scale of 1, opacity of 1. At 50%, we want it to be the border max width solid with the border color we've set, and scale of the max scale. And opacity of 0, so it's fading as it goes. And we want it to come back to at 100% to where it started at the beginning. So that's pretty much our keyframes. So that's an explanation of the CSS. I hope that makes sense. Play with it as much as you can. Come up with some really cool ideas for making this even better. And I'd love it if you let me know what you come up with. Okay.